Hi, my name is Bibek Adhikari. I am an English instructor. In today's class, we are going to solve the grammar portion of Unit 17, that is relative clauses. So let's begin. Alright, in this class, we are going to learn about relative clauses. Relative clauses are clauses starting with relative pronouns. So they are clauses starting with relative pronouns. Alright, they are clauses starting with relative pronouns. Now the question is, what are relative pronouns? Pronouns like who, that, which, whose, where, and when are called relative pronouns. They're most often used to define or identify the noun that precedes them. For example, do you know the girl who started grade 7 last week? Now look at this question. Look at this, example. Do you know the girl who started grade 7 last week? Let me write a couple of more examples. Can I have the pencil that I gave you this morning? So if you look at these two examples, we have two different words acting as a relative pronoun. So I'm going to write RP for relative pronouns. And what is this relative pronoun doing? It is identifying, or rather defining, the noun that precedes them. What is the noun? The girl is the noun in the first sentence, while the pencil is the noun in the second sentence. And the relative pronoun is defining the girl, while in this case, the relative pronoun is defining the pencil. All right? Let me write one more example. I won't eat in a restaurant whose cooks smoke. So I won't eat in a restaurant whose cooks smoke. What is the relative pronoun? Whose is the relative pronoun? What is the noun? Restaurant is the noun. What is who doing? And it is defining the restaurant. So I won't eat in a restaurant whose cooks smoke. So what kind of restaurant is it? It is the kind of restaurant where the cooks smoke. All these relative clauses, they are called the defining relative clauses. So these are defining relative clauses. Alright, these are called the defining relative clauses. There is a relative pronoun whom, alright, which can be used as the object of the relative clause. Keep that in mind. For now, let's study some examples. First example is, I live in London, which has some fantastic parks. Let me write one more example. Mr. Karki, who lives in Tamil, has 3 wives. Alright, let's look at the first relative pronoun. What is the relative pronoun? Which is the relative pronoun? What is the second relative pronoun? Which is the relative pronoun? What is this relative pronoun doing? This is defining the place, the noun that precedes. And this is also defining a person, the noun that precedes. Alright, but something is different, In these relative clauses give us, extra information about something. We don't need this information to understand the sentence, do we? That is why these clauses are called non-defining relative clauses, since these clauses, they do not define the first sentence or the first clause. And did you notice the use of comma? Commas are used in non-defining relative clauses, while in defining relative clauses, we did not use any commas. That is the main thing, main punctuation idea. Alright, let's start with the defining relative clauses. The defining relative clauses, first of all, the relative pronoun is the subject. So we are discussing about that condition when the relative pronoun is the subject. First, let's consider when the relative pronoun is the subject of a defining relative clause. We can use who, which, or that. We can use who for people, which for things, and that for people or things. So we can use who for people, we can use which for things, and we can use that for either people or things. The relative clause can come after the subject or the object of the sentence. We can't drop the relative pronouns, so relative pronouns are the most. These are the most. Alright, so we cannot drop them. And the reason is that another thing is the relative clause can come after the subject or object of the sentence. So after subject or object, the relative clauses would appear. Let's understand this by studying some examples. She has a son who, or you can use that, is a doctor. Let me give you one more example. We bought a house which, or you can use that, is 20 years old. So in these two sentences, what is the relative pronoun? Either who or that. In the second sentence, which or that is the relative pronoun, and they are defining the noun that precedes. First sentence, the noun is the sun, while in the second sentence, the noun is the house. Alright, so this is how you can use the defining relative clauses. And one of the reasons why we use, defining relative clauses is because they define the noun. Alright, so everything is defined in this context. You see, in the first example, the son is defined by the quality that he is a doctor by his profession. In the second sentence, the house is defined by its age. That is why these clauses are called defining relative clauses. Now let's go to the second subsection, which is relative pronoun as the object. Now in this case, the RP or the relative pronoun is the object. In the first case, the relative pronoun was the subject. Now we are talking about RP as the object. Now let's talk about when the relative pronoun is the object of the clause. In this case, we can drop the relative pronoun if we want to. Again, the clause can come after the subject or object of the sentence. So what are the different clauses again? Who for people, alright? Which for what? Which for animals? Which for things? And that for again, people or things. There is something different when, we are using relative pronoun as the object. We can actually drop them. So it is not mandatory. It is not compulsory to use these relative pronouns. We can actually drop them. Let's see how this is done. She loves the chocolate. You can either say which or you can say that I bought. Let me write one more example and we'll understand. We'll talk about them. We went to the village. You can say either use which or you can use that Lucy recommended. Now if you look at these two examples, what is the relative pronoun? Which or that is the relative pronoun. And what is the relative pronoun in the second sentence? Again, which or that is the relative pronoun. And what are these doing? They are defining the noun that is just ahead of them. So they are defining chocolate here, and in the second sentence, they're defining the village. Alright, now let's study these sentences by dropping the relative clauses. She loves the chocolate I bought. The sentence sounds perfectly fine. We don't need to use the relative clause. We went to the village, which Lucy or that Lucy recommended. So these relative clauses are in fact optional. That is why I have kept the relative clauses inside the brackets or parentheses. Now let's talk about the second kind of relative clause, which is called non-defining relative clauses. So we don't use that in non-defining relative clauses. Let us be very clear. We are not going to use this word that in non-defining relative clauses. So we need to use which if the pronoun refers to a thing. So if we are referring to some thing, we are going to use which instead of that. And if we are talking about a person, we are going to use who. We can't drop the relative pronoun in this kind of clause. Never drop the relative pronoun. So dropping of the relative pronoun is simply impossible. So even if the relative pronoun is subject or object, it does not matter what, we are never going to drop the relative pronoun. And another significant and another important thing is we use commas. Could be or comma sometime, or sometimes commas. Alright, so in non-defining relative clauses, we use commas to separate the clause from rest of the sentence. Let's look at some examples. My teacher, who is very nice, lives in Guarco. One more example. Yesterday, I called our friend Jerry, who lives in Tamil. Alright, first relative clause is who, the relative pronoun. Second is also who. If you look at the first sentence, we have used two commas in order to separate this chunk of information, which is called the non-defining relative clause, while in the second portion, we have only used a single comma to separate this clause. So if you study these examples closely, you will find that these are the non-defining relative clauses, all right? Because they do not define the relative clause, but rather give extra information about the relative, about the noun, about the first clause. All right, pretty easy. Now let me give you some homework. Homework is going to be pretty easy. All you have to do is complete the sentences by using the correct relative pronouns. The first one is The man, blank space, is sitting on a chair is my brother. Now number B. Chame is the place. It's a blank space. They went for hiking. Are there more examples in your book? You can try more examples. Like there's question 1, 2, and 3. Try solving all those questions. But for now, I'm going to give you just these 2 homeworks. All right. Point of this lesson is to learn the differences between the defining relative clauses and the non-defining relative clauses. And another thing that you should be very careful about is the use of relative pronoun as the subject or object of the sentence. All right. With this, we have come to end of today's class. If you have any questions or suggestions regarding these video series, feel free to write us at learning@deerwalk.edu.np. Thank you.